Okay, theoretically, we are on our way here. Let me share the screen and get the opening little commercial going here to remind you where we are. This is Evolution Hour, and we've got Jackson Wheat with us today. We're going to be
Hello.
discussing more of Jeanson's Stupid. We got some stuff on the reptile mammal transition. We'll be dealing with all the nice, wonderful stuff, updating our various work. Jackson is busy with his thesis material. It's an exciting world
Indeed.
where I was just listening to the president's speech. I was in. It's so nice to have a president that we can listen to without having steam coming out of our ears and be nervous as to what the hell's going to be happening. Oh, and I got chat coming in. Great. Hello, everybody. I see Lamont's in there. Yay!
Ahoy.
And we got Scott Duke. Yeah. We're going to be, as usual, we're at, I think, episode 50 of the Replacing Darwin Tearing Apart project, and continuing with chapter 7 on that. And then also part 2 will be relating to British creationist Andy McIntosh taking a side swipe at the reptile mammal transition in a way that is not helping his case any. Anyway, let me get all the thank yous out of the way for our patrons, our colleagues Hendro, Colton, Eric Rowley, Cyrus, and Zeshi, researchers Travis Adams, Ian Chen, Convert Me, Stephen Early, Ethan Neal, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Apologia, Benjamin Simpson, Speed of Sound, Assistant Researchers, Command Cyborg, Doranku, Jelly, Totus Real, Christopher Johnson, friend Stephen Bauman, Marigale Beddoes, Daniel, Insects Cool, Morton Nielsen, Paul Skeptic, Buffalopagus, Bo Rasmussen, Devin Reeves, Alex Stone, and Paul Williams. And a thank as well to the legacy patrons, Jen and Jody, Mike, John, Keith, Andrew, Dyer, Yui, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Nanya, Staggle, Sun, Sky Stone, Ugly Drummond, Trultz, Everett, Sons, and Sewer Weisbaum, who helped at one point or another. And I'm going to continue to thank you anyway. Oh, there. So, hi, Diana. Lavender Lady is in there. Lisa for Truth, hello there. So, last week, all of you were hanging on, I'm sure, to the exciting world of Jeanson actually bringing up some mutation rate technical papers. And before I analyzed first, he misrepresented the contents or avoided the implications of what was in them. Well, there's 4 more. The other half of his section, which included a 2010 paper by Osowski on plant mutations, and then a 2015 paper by Farlow on yeast, and which turned out actually had drawn on Osawa's work. And then, on bacteria, he cites 2 of Bolensky papers, Barrick 2009 and Blunt 2012. As Jackson is well aware, bringing up the LTEE experiment as somehow helpful to any creationist argument is an activity fraught with peril, as we explained in great detail in our book.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, that and
And
both papers
recently,
yeah,
Dan Cardinale brought it up with the Michael Behe himself. So that was fun.
and he was not exactly ridiculously informed on the subject, but then again, as we noted, there's reasons why he just isn't terribly informed on this kind of stuff. He's operating too far away from the data field on it. So anyway, starting off, fortunately, most of those papers are available open access. And so I put a link up to Academia EDU on the Osowski paper. That is and spontaneous mutations in our good old friend Arabidopsis.
Uh-huh.
Well, for one thing, this was the setup here is the footnote in Jeanson's book, where he lists off all these various organisms and the little footnote for the papers. And at the end of the paragraph, after he doesn't really describe a heck of a lot about why things mutations, he puts in this proviso. He says that the primary reason for these mutations is unknown. Bum, bum, bum. Well, Osowski's paper apparently didn't get the memo. Because first of all, it worked out that spontaneous mutation rate, they made a slighted judgment to it to where it was 7 times 10 to the minus 9 base substitutions per site. They noted that a majority of them are GCs to ATs, and by majority, it's ridiculously majority. I mean, you can see the chart here. Whoops, let me get closer to the camera. The thing that sticks up really high, that's those mutations. And everything else is almost background by comparison to them, of which a chunk are transition mutations, where it goes from purine to purine or pyrimide to pyrimidine. And then the rest are transversions that are the less likely, where it actually converts to a different form on that one. Anyway, they quite explicitly noted, we explain this very biased spectrum of base substitution mutations as a result of two main processes: deamination of methylated cytosines and ultraviolet light-induced mutagenesis. So apparently they weren't aware of the fact that they weren't supposed to have worked out why these mutations were occurring. Now, the fun part's going to come with the other papers, because it's not one size fits all. Different organisms have different dynamics. But what's so interesting about this paper from the get-go, is that it's not a mutation rate. It's a spectrum of mutation rates that vary depending upon where in the organism it is. That what was so neat about this, they had involved millions and millions of things studied in these 30 lineages that they were able to deal with. So they were able to isolate along the chromosomes the very specific mutations that were going on and catalog what kinds they were. This is way miles ahead of the cartoon version that we're getting in Jeanson's book. And this is one of the papers that he cited. Well, the authors alluded to how their work reduced uncertainties on the divergence time of Thaliana from A. lyrata. But I looked through the paper and they actually don't go into any details on that. So my little antennas went off and go, oh, where is that? What is going on that? And I'm wondering whether or not Jeanson ever had a light bulb go off all over his head, wondering from his creationist perspective when or if there was a differentiation in this particular plant within the creationist context. Well, he's got some hurdles to deal with, because the various papers that we had, in which I've got in there, a 2013 paper that I've got the PDF I'll be putting in the link to, and a 2018 paper from Hanada, they're all operating within the range that Thaliana diverged into this other species between 5 and 10 million years ago. And the details of the gene duplications that were involved and the activation of the gene duplications in these lineages favored much more after that, 5 or 10 million years down the road, and millions of years later, some of these gene duplications then were carrying in new functions. So we've got functional divergence of duplicated genes several million years after gene duplication in Arabidopsis by Hanada. And then we've got, that one's got some very, very nice little, those horrifying cladistic patterns and things where they're breaking down the lineage details. By the way, Jeanson didn't cite any of this stuff and couldn't cite a 2018 paper because that's after the book came out. But what's curious is the fact that this is the operating field that is implied by his citing of the Osowski paper. So we can measure what the regular scientists are doing in the field versus the cartoon land of young Earth creationism, where it never quite gets past that generic cartoon mode, although he's got charts and stuff later on. Then we've got the Wang paper, Divergent Evolutionary Expression Patterns Between Lineage-Specific New Duplicate Genes and Their Parental Analogs. They also break down the details of when they're thinking all of that's taking place. And then, just for meringue, we've got a paper from 2012 by Payayarvi et al., which is going into gruesome detail. They studied, I think it's hundreds of different varieties and things of the various branches of the lyrata bunch, where, depending on whether you were in North America or in Eurasia, we're talking about splits anywhere from tens of thousands of years ago to over 100 or 200 or 300,000 years ago. Needless to say, all of this is not fitting in with the creationist time frame.
No.
And all of that was just following up that one paper. And then the yeast paper, Farlow 2015 on yeast, which, by the way, was aware of Osowski's work. And so that shows you how the real scientists are interconnecting, because they're going, "Ooh, we've got a more precise mutation rate for plants to calibrate." And what they were looking at is how many different variations there are, that same level of spectrum of mutation rates is occurring in different organisms as well. And so you've got a completely different dynamic going on in yeast, and in fact, different dynamics going on between fission and budding yeasts, where they're suggesting that the mechanisms of DNA maintenance may have diverged significantly between the two different varieties of yeast. Yeast, of course, being, and you can correct me on this one if I goofed up on there, your little fungi and your yeast are Precambrian things, where you've got genetics, the basement of their stuff is going back long before the Cambrian explosion. And so there's been a lot of room for variations, including the fact that the fungi, don't they have like 5 sexes?
As
they're really very
well, yes, you are correct that it does go way back past the Cambrian. I believe the oldest are around 1 billion years old. That's Orosphera geraldiae. And so it's way, like, the amount of time between Cambrian is the amount of time between the Cambrian and
the Cambrian, yeah.
Yeah, and that fossil.
By any definition, that's a long time.
And the fungi, they have lots and lots and lots of like sexes, because it just depends on how they shuffle their genome and all that fun stuff. And so it's probably like lots and lots of them. It just depends, or your mating types. But yeah, so
yeah, it's a matter that, as in the plants, which you have done. Lamont had you on, and it was an excellent. I was there as like a little background thing, because
you enjoyed that,
you were doing the main
plant evolution talk, huh?
I loved it because it clarified so much on it. It shows that both plants and fungi are examples of organisms that have a very long wind-up lineage that is Precambrian in nature, and they have undergone an amazing amount of variety. In which case, actually, looking at it from our vertebrate point of view, we're boring. We're rather drab.
Yeah, they underwent multiple, or they underwent more endosymbiotic events. Then they evolved multicellularity a whole bunch of times, and yeah.
And the neat thing about plants, of course, is unlike us boring vertebrates, where we've only got the one main endosymbiont, the mitochondria, which predates the development of chordates. It's a deep basement animal thing. Your plants have got the chloroplasts in there, so they've got multiple endosymbiotic things, and they show they shuffle around their genomes and duplicate genomes on a scale that's just, you don't find as many gene duplication events knocking around in the vertebrates. So we're boring.
Yeah.
We're boring sexually. We're boring anatomically. Mammals have almost all the same number of neck vertebrae. It's just drab, dull, dishwater stuff compared to those funky little fungi and the plants.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, question. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, fungi are so weird. They actually break the haploid diploid distinction, where they are technically haploid, but they have 2 nuclei in the same cell, and so if they ever need it, they can just put them together.
And that's a matter of how redundancy works in them. And here, if you want to get meta, what we're talking about is the whole notion of evolvability. Once you have a particular system and packaging of, I will use the word to trigger off a Tangelo or Sal Cordova, information in the genome. Once you have these compartmental systems going on, they have potentially different ways to interact. And one of the higher level discussions, and it's in my head because in the great sorting that I've been doing, I've often been bumping into papers that are talking about evolvability and the higher level structure of stuff. That to what extent our varying package models have greater fecundity and variation possibilities and more resilience to mass extinction events and to perturbations and all of that. And so we don't know, because we don't know of all the forms that went extinct. We don't know what was the problem with trilobites. Did they have some fatal flaw in their structure that made them less evolvable in the long term and less resilient to where they finally fizzled out? Is
Yeah.
that the case as well with ammonites versus nautiloids? Is it the case between the early Ornithine birds versus the ornithines? Because
Mhm.
one group survived the KT extinction, the other one didn't.
Right.
And so we don't know that because you don't have the thing to compare it up with. I put a thing up here Lisa brings up, totally off topic, like that's new for us. Did the Roman Empire boys become gladiators to escape poverty? Good question. I can't think offhand of anybody in the patrician class who goes off and becomes a gladiator because they feel like it. That no, this is something that's for the working class. A lot of it are slaves. If you've ever seen the movie Spartacus, it's bearing on an awful lot of truth of the idea that somebody might be decide to escape or being sold off to the gladiatorial arena as potential meat to be killed. You didn't really have a choice in it. Gladiators did have a groupie aspect. It's very similar to sports figures. I mean, there were rich patrician women would carry little vials around with them where they would go and they would scoop the sweat off of the gladiators' bodies after the events and keep them as like souvenirs. You know, this is, I know, weird.
Yeah, that's a little
And
strange.
yeah, and so that's part of the thing. But the only one that I can think of is a higher level guy that was into this sort of stuff was Emperor Commodus, and I think also two. I think either Domitian or one of the others was kind of into wrestling and gladiatorial stuff. Ironically, Nero hated gladiatorial games. He didn't mind killing people, but he didn't want to have to watch them do it.
Really
He
bizarre.
wanted somebody else. He was an outsourcer on that, but he thought the gladiatorial games were too violent, and he actually tried to ban them at times, which got absolutely nowhere. If you think that the NFL and the basketball associations have huge vested marketing interests in sustaining business, that's nothing compared to the industry that had grown up around the gladiatorial games and all of that. And in fact, there's some argument that an awful lot of animals got hunted to extinction
Yeah.
by them being pulled in to be used in the gladiatorial arenas because they loved exotic animals and all sorts of weird stuff that was going on. They would have mock naval battles that they've been just recently done archaeology to figure out you could in fact have water pumped into the Colosseum and flooded at various points, and they'd figure out how they brought the water in and how they drained it all out. They've discovered the little mechanisms of all of that stuff. So it's
That's
an
wild.
ongoing principle. So how dare you bring up such a secondary subject around a Roman Empire groupie? Uh, I have a whole stash of works downstairs in a project that I was reminded of during the Great Sorting. I had huge amounts of material, old 19th century books on the Roman traditions and the various procedures and things, dictionaries of ancient Rome. I had printed out full copy, and the dates on the bottom when I printed them out were 2006. Here it is, 15 years since I have actually looked at some of this stuff, and I've finished up putting them into folders and all that kind of stuff. So I got that all organized. So so
A little
so your yeah, it's been a little while. I have a lot of stuff on that. Anyway, so the Philo paper then on yeast has that same range of stuff, and then on the bacteria stuff, will shameless book plug. The rocks were there has a
oh
very extensive analysis because Georgia Purdom kind of bounces a bit into the LTEE. Another creationist actually went into it in more detail, which didn't help him any. Michael Behe is ricocheted off of it. It's one that they've carped at in a variety of areas. And for Jeanson to bring up, he's not criticizing the LTEE. I don't think I'll be interested to see whether he ever discusses any of it ever again in the book. All he was trying to do was kind of authority quoted because here he's being sciencey. He's citing science papers on mutation rates, but not
mm-hmm.
dealing with any of the content of them. So he's now gone from 0 for 4 to 0 for 8 because in all 4 of those papers he's avoiding the content and their implications in relation to the actual organisms.
Well,
Yeah, yeah. It's uh, I am not ridiculously impressed with Jeanson's stuff. Admittedly, his book looks more sciency than Sanford's book did, and less sciency than Rupin Sanford's. Rupin Sanford is way ahead of them in terms of the level of documentation. They were citing way more stuff per page than Jeanson did. But Jeanson at least has a patina of referencing that's going on because Sanford's book is, and what was amazing me about Sanford's genetic entropy work is how relentlessly it was being drawn upon by various anti-evolutionists, including people in the Discovery Institute orbit, thanks to Sal Cordova, who was bringing this stuff up as he was mutating from an intelligent design groupie into a young Earth creationist, which, by the way, goes back quite a bit. In the Great Sorting, I stumbled across some people who were noting Sal's stuff back in 2005, which is quite a ways back in his resume. And they were explicitly referring to him as a young Earth creationist. So the mutation from sort of intelligent designer at Evolution News into full-blown creationist didn't seem to take very long, as far as I can see, and has stayed that way ever since. Anyway, I'll be putting all the links into all those little papers on that. And if you want to find out more about the LTEE thing, we listed off, I think there are like 50 or 60 papers that have been done over the years on the LTEE, and of which most of them were in the time frame that the creationists were criticizing ought to have been aware of them. And oddly, this one minor guy, I've forgotten his name already, Lyman or something like that, as I recall, had bumped into about a dozen of them. And in every instance, the details weren't what he was presenting in there. Anyway, other half. Absolutely appalled to hear that. Give us some update on where you are in your exciting world of thesis land.
Well, I'm still doing the research. One of my professors, not technically my advisor, but one of my professors, one of my counselors, suggested I do my thesis work over the summer also. So I'll be doing that this summer. Yay!
Yay! Yes. And by that time, I should be knee deep into restructuring and backing into right mode. The image I have in mind is the River Rouge plant that Henry Ford had. Have you ever heard of that one? River Rouge was the ultimate Ford manufacturing facility because when he was building the Model Ts, he adopted the assembly line, which he didn't invent. He actually got the idea from Henry Leland over at Cadillac, and then up the ante. And what you were getting was parts and things and girders and pieces of stuff that were being outsourced. And he realized what he really wanted to do was to have a complete in-house system where raw coal and raw iron was being dumped at one end of the factory. It was processed and converted into Model T Fords at the other end of the factory, all in one gigantic operation.
Well,
and that's what River Rouge was. It was the ultimate in manufacturing.
Did he ever succeed?
Oh yeah. River Rouge was one of the great gigantic things. It was all converted over to a warplane. I can't remember whether it was B-24s or whatever they were building during the war, and so it was retoolable. But it was the ultimate of where literally raw material goes in one end and finished product goes out the other, with no outsourcing of any of the subcomponents.
Well,
and this, of course, was when you were building much simpler vehicles in those days. In fact, in the late era of the Model T Ford, they didn't even have a driver's side doorway. It was just a solid sheet of metal that had a ribble in it to look like it was a door, but it wasn't actually a functioning doorway. You had to get in on the driver's side and climb over the stick shift.
Oh my goodness!
The driver's seat on a Ford, and that stopped in I think the 25, 26 model years. They had to abandon that because they were getting their butt handed to them by Chevrolet, that was selling a car that was a bit more expensive than the Model T Ford, but it was like a car. It had a functioning door, and it had it looked more modern with the new styles that were coming along in that period. And so you felt like you were driving a fancier machine when you were in a Chevrolet than you were when you were in a Model T Ford. And his son, Edsel, Ford had to persuade him to give up building the damn Model T Fords. And so he designed the Model A that helped save the company. And Daddy finally was sold on the idea and immediately took credit for it. So there was no discussion of Edsel when the Model A was issued. It was all Ford's idea, Henry's idea. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is the wonderful history of things. Anyway, the analog then with what I'm doing with the TIP project and the books that we're doing, and also my Paralogs of Fog thing, is that basically raw material is ideally coming in, new source material that I'm encountering, and then it gets triaged and formatted into what's going on, and I'm working on finished product, finished text at the end of all of that without any little sidebars of having to wonder about catching up with this and reformatting that and resorting all of that kind of stuff. And so I'm aiming at the River Rouge of book writing.
Well,
to cover all of the, that's the evil plan. And effectively, I'd gotten into that mode. It just is that with the great sorting at 2 months of rearrangement to get all that material resorted for the various books. But now that that's pretty much out of the way, get back to the River Rouge mode. Now on to part 2. Oh, and I suppose I should prep up our little Rocks promo. We'll stick on towards the tail end of the show. There we go. And I can then trim that into place and show that, because you gotta shameless plug these days. Anyway, the part 2 is kind of a light one. Andy McIntosh in January of 2020 put up a posting in the Creation magazine called Our Created Ear. Boom, boom, boom.
Bum, bum, bum.
And it's not very long. It has just some generic stuff about oceanic bubble acoustics and ultrasonic cleaning and just some side issues. But along the way, he happens to take a side swipe at the reptile-mammal transition that I wrote a whole book on. He doesn't mention me specifically or anybody specifically, but the paragraph is a really hilarious one.
Okay.
These are the old. He's talking about the stapes and stuff, not the stapes, but the other bones that are modified from the reptile jaw. And by the way, that the stapes is not one of them. That's actually a much older bone that comes from fish and has been modified over time. Anyway, he says, quote, "These are the only bones in the body that do not grow in size after birth. Believers in evolution try to argue that upper and lower parts of the jaw bones of a reptile move to become the malleus and incus bones, but quietly ignore one of the biggest hurdles to such a story, namely that the jaws of reptiles never stop growing!" Exclamation mark. There are
wait, what?
couple. Yeah. There's one big flaw in his argument right off the bat, and that is that the reptiles he's looking at aren't the reptiles that the reptile-mammal transition involves. That I use the term reptile with almost in quotation marks, and I describe all the things on it, that the synapsids long predate the organisms that split off from the amniotes to form the reptiles. So it's none of the current lizards and stuff that are seen as the ancestral group. And so the growth patterns of current reptile jaws has no bearing on the issue of what was happening 300 million years ago in the synapsid line.
There's a deeper issue here. The deeper issue here is that he's suggesting like the actual structural morphology of bones changes as you age. That's what he's suggesting here, which is bonkers.
It's the idea that somehow or other that because the dynamics of those bones are different than what modern reptiles do with their jaw. And remember what we're talking about here. Here's the handy little cutie. Put up, RJ, did you see Gonna Go For It has added you and Jackson to a Twitter DM with me? Okay, we'll have to find out what that's going on back in Twitter, because I shut down Twitter when I go online on my cute little laptop here, which I will thank again Scientist Mel for gifting me this device so that we can do these sorts of things and be in that technology, because she was very busy with her own education and teaching and paper grading and all the other things. And I see her on Twitter, and it's happy to be able to disconnect so that she doesn't have to handhold old RJ every week into the internet thing. But anyway,
bafflingly stupid.
Yeah, you got you have the dentary bone, and then there's several other bones in the standard, and it's not just reptiles, it's amphibians, it's fish, it's the whole 9 yards. It's the standard vertebrate jaw structure that we're talking about here, and that there is a different jaw hinge that's involved with all vertebrates other than mammals. And I've gone into that in previous shows and written the whole bloody book about that, the evolution slam dunk that goes into how creationists deal with it. But the idea that Andy McIntosh, for those of you who are not aware of Andy McIntosh, he's a rather truculent British creationist who pops up every once in a while. I think he's had a run-in with Richard Dawkins on occasion. He has a not gigantic amount of publication stuff, and he's not, other than occasional posts like this popping up. Let me see what I got in my references. I happen to have the reference bibliography up. Where is good old McIntosh in here?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm really. I don't really know if I remember him from anything.
He's kind of peripheral to the average creationist. You're much more likely to be bumping in on, of course, online. You're going to be slamming into, your raw mat level and standing for truth types. But he's been around for quite a few years. Let's see. I got my reference bibliography open on my main computer. His technical name is Andrew C., and he has been published in actual technical literature over the years and still does that every once in a while, but he then moonlights as well. He's done a thing for the New Answers book. One of the New Answers book chapters he wrote with Bodhi Hodge, How Did Defense Attack Structures Come About? Which is trying to grapple with the idea of predation and tooth and claw when everything was created perfect without any tooth and claw. And he has to kind of rationalize all that way. He's got, I have first thing I have from him is 2007, and the most recent, of course, he's done a thing on the created era, and in the same period, he also did the amazing Bombardier Beetle, which is beating a dead horse. And we're going to be alluding to that in Rocks Volume 2, because
beating
that's
a fossilized horse.
Yeah. Well, the neat point of it is that while there's been an awful lot of research on the Bombardier Beetle to make that whole argument one that Andy should not have been trying to bring up in 2020 in the Creation magazine, then he's got, in fact, he's done a thing back in 2018 at the Creationism conference with Joseph Lawrence, The Extraordinary Design of the Bombardier Beetle. And then he's done some collaborative stuff on flood models and the flood as the major biblical cataclysm from 2000. So he's got an assortment in there. But I can easily see why anybody who was diving into creationism full bore could easily have overlooked him, and you could get through an entire apologetic environment and never actually encounter an Andy McIntosh piece. He's relatively a minor leaguer in terms of it, although I think he's much more widely known over in Britain, where he's one of the vanguards of the bunch that's funneling ICR, AIG style creationism in Britain. Oh, hello, David Neff. And Atheist Junior's in there. Oh, by the way, I shall be debating this weekend.
Oh,
let's see.
A debate? You didn't tell me about that.
Yeah, a 2 versus 2 debate with Otangelo and Phil Williams on the Finding Noah's Ark and the Global Flood.
Oh, Christ.
Yeah, this will be on James's Modern Day Debate channel. I got lured into the thing. You know how I am. I'm just a sucker for these sorts of things. Because it's an interesting.
I thought Otangelo, is he ID or is he YEC?
Oh, Otangelo is a young Earth creationist, and apparently he'd already debated this subject previously, and I got a review debate with the same guy, with Williams being his co-person. Otangelo is not that well aware, as I recall, with the geology, paleontology, biogeography, genetic issues of the global flood, or the search for Noah's Ark history. He's essentially an origins or bust obsessive when he appears on the various things, whether it's Mike's speed of sound stuff, or with Dan Cardinale or Erica or anybody else. He's a one-note Charlie. I mean, we're going to be getting a pile of authority quotes, and he's talking about origin of information and complex systems and that. And so in that respect, Tangelo's talking points are almost entirely the sort you would get from intelligent design apologetics. And I think he scavenges an awful lot of stuff from the Discovery Institute gang, because they're the ones that obsess on it. But doctrinally, he's a younger creationist, as far as I can tell. Lisa says, don't make responsibilities per se. I find topics that creationists use and argue against those. Yeah, there's several different modes you can deal with. I'm open-ended improv style as to debate formats. It can be a discussion. It can be a formal debate. It doesn't matter. Whatever the format is, I'll adapt to it. The main point is to be on your ball in terms of knowing what your opponent's positions are. The worst debaters, and we all have seen a few, are the ones who don't know diddly squat about the subject and think to come in with a kind of generic poo-poo quality, and they get their clocks cleaned often. And if you can lose a debate with a creationist, if you can look like an uninformed lout when dealing with a young Earth creationist, that's on you, because there's no excuse for that level of incompetence. Titan says, Otangelo designs machines and thinks everything is mechanistic. There's a long tradition of that in anti-evolutionism, if you're unaware of it. Engineers, people who are used to doing stress analysis on girders, chemical chemists. It's revealing the number of biochemists that are in that area. Michael Denton, Michael Behe, Dwayne Gish was a biochemist, that are used to the chemical interactions of biology, but not the biological impact of the chemical interactions, because they're not biologists per se. They tend not to be zoologists. They're very rare to find a paleontologist, and if they do, they're not doing much paleontology. But if you have a mind that thinks in terms of structural engineering, you're already pre-formatted to think in terms of a designer that makes the design. This is where computer programmers, they're another bunch that have a certain predilection for anti-evolution positions, because they're used to looking at it from a computer programmer's point of view, where you have the mind that puts the if-and loops in there, and you naturally think that anything that looks like that in a biological context must therefore be designed as well. So it's very enticing, as opposed to the ones who look at how the biology actually functions, and they start seeing how the biology does stuff that functions in a way that you can make mathematical analogs for, but isn't really designed. We see flocking behavior in birds, for example, and some of the how cockroaches go after their mates, and crickets and others that make clicking sounds and stuff. It turns out exceedingly simple behaviorist rules as to how they react to acoustic waves and how they react to things can account for their behavior without any complicated things going on. And some of the things, very intricate behavior can arise from extremely simple things, flocking behavior being one of those, where no individual bird is hearing from mission control how to maintain the flock structure. The bird is just looking at where it is relative to another bird and following ass, or deciding to kind of move forward a little bit and feeling the gusts and shifting back and forth. So there's a bunch of purely mechanistic feedback loops that are happening that end result in a big flock structure. And the same thing occurs with fish, huge swirls of fish in the sea. It turns out that that sort of stuff has a meta level where if you're a predator, it's harder to get lunch with an individual fish if it's in a swirling mass that way. So it's an excellent predator response thing without it being intelligent. It's that organisms that have ended up doing that get by better to pass on their genes to the organisms that will continue to do that because it works.
Indeed.
And so that's a nod back to that evolvability thing. Yeah, jump in there, Jackson.
Oh, I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah, and so there's quite here we go. It's quite a background literature on this kind of stuff. It connects up as well to one of those that you do hear a lot, both in intelligent design and creationist material over the years, which is migrations, the miracle of migration. How does the animal know to fly all of this time? And of course, you get some very complicated patterns in, say, monarch butterflies, which, as I recall, the monarch butterfly that actually flies north is like the second generation down from the one that actually flew south. That you have some of these very intricate patterns that's going on, and you have to wonder why it is and how it is they know. Some of it involves navigation by polarity of light, and you have to wonder to what extent are some of these things happening because of climate cues and shifting land masses that have reached the point where originally they were closer together than they are now, and they're got stuck in this mode of long distance migration. And again, there's probably no one size fits all. There's a bunch of different dynamics that are going on. The end result, you can check me on this one. It's although there are spectacular cases of migration, most animals don't migrate, at least not on the super duper long distance thing. But there are some long distance.
Most don't do super long distance. So
yeah, and that's true for insects, it's true for birds, it's true for animals. And so there's still some debates, for example, as to whether or not you can detect by fossil distribution whether certain animals had migratory routes in the past. That you can use analogs with animals that definitely migrate today. Caribou, for example, migrate distances in order to do stuff. Various organisms winter in one area and then summer in another because their diet shifts and they have the thing where they have to get to where they can eat things. And so there's debates about extinct animals like dinosaurs as to how many of the herds, hadrosaurs and ceratopsids in particular, whether any of them had long migratory routes or not, whether ceratopsids that all live in the northern hemisphere, did they go north when the stuff was available and then south afterwards? And as far as I can recall from the dinosaur thing, if a Dapper Dino or somebody was in the field, maybe they could correct me on the issue, or if they see the video at some point, let me know. But I would say that my recollection of it is that it's up in the air, that there's very few examples that are clear-cut examples of where there was long-term migration going on. And it may be very taxa specific. And that's one of the reasons why any paleontologist worth their salt would probably sell their grandmother to be able to go into a time machine, to go back in time, see the actual organisms in play, and to be able to observe it directly, because there's only so much you can get from looking at the taphonomy stuff. BJ says is one bird that migrates from South Africa to England. The longest ranges for any of these things are just ridiculously long. If you see them on a global map, you've got something in one hemisphere going to somewhere way far away, and we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of miles. I think there's some argument that gliders, the big super gliders amongst the pterosaurs, may have undergone quite a lot of migrating. And that's another area where it pops up, because inevitably, when you see how living organisms behave, you want to go, well, could there be something like that with an extinct organism? And you want to try to see the cues and clues that are going on in there. But anyway, then all of that ultimately has stuff relating to what's going on in the brain, and what kind of, how much of it's instinctive and how much of it varies. And I think they've already spotted in some insects where migratory patterns are shifting because the temperatures of the planet's changing, so that the target areas, both at their destination end and the target end, is altering the cues so that they're moving around. And I think they've seen examples in some insects in that of where they're shifting they're directional gradients as well, and all of that presumably is based upon stuff that's going on inside their little bug brain that is dictating why they do the behavior that they do. And throw in any comments that you may have heard about that as well.
I'm not really super familiar with migration stuff. The thing that I'm working on right now does not. They're too small.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that's actually at the opposite extreme. Another thing that was popping up in my head because I was doing the sorting and I was just getting into the Cambrian section and getting this stuff stuck down on the stacks on the floor now, about the role of developmental biology in the development of sessile forms or not. Because
yes.
tunicates, being at the very base of the chordate line, starts out as a free-living larva and then settles down, plants its little butt on the seafloor and devours its brain like an associate professor getting tenure, as
Right.
somebody snarkily referred, and it becomes a little filter feeding bag.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because the thinking was that originally that it was the Eurochordates at the base of chordata, and so it was like we gain the ability to move, but no, it turns out actually they're secondarily sessile because the cephalochordates, the lancelets, are the most basal.
Yeah,
the basally derived.
Yeah,
chordates.
and that of course is one of those things that you just guaranteed to relate to the loss of information canard. The idea that a biological process or genetic system can be turned off or down and change the behavior in ways that turns into something entirely new. And so there's I'll type in a little word, heterochrony, which is one that anybody that knows Stephen Jay Gould practically should have that on a motto on the wall, that the variations in the rates at which things occur, which can be temporal, it can be spatial, can have enormous effects on how the animal ends up doing different things. And that can occur at absolutely any level. So if you Google that concept, you can find out an awful lot. And it's at one of the core issues of how developmental biology and evo-devo can relate to macro changes based upon tweaking of existing systems. Well, there's been no change then if the existing system hasn't changed. Oh, want to bet? Because you can alter the rates at which it's going. So Lisa asked a question about what do you think of Kant's... Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Good question.
Asked, what do you think of Kant's ridiculous claim that the Grand Canyon is a breached dam? As usual with Kant Hovind, this ain't his idea. That you have a problem with the Grand Canyon formation. What he's doing is very a logical result of the Grand Canyon being a catastrophic idea. You've got the land being formed because the base of the canyon, of course, is Precambrian, and so the usual mode is that that's created rock. That's pre-flood. Then there's all the ones with fossils in them, which is the upper zones from the Cambrian basically on up. The upper layers of the canyon are in the Cretaceous and Jurassic period, depending upon which side of the canyon you're on. As you go north, you start bumping into Jurassic deposits, and that continues all the way up into Bryce Canyon and Zion and all of that. There's a little brief geology of Colorado, Utah, and Arizona area. Anyway, that stuff, virtually all creationists agree is flood deposit. Well, if that's deposited by the flood, where does the canyon come from? Because the canyon must be formed by carving water coming into existing rock. So they've got to get the slurry that's laying down all of that stuff, turn it into rock, and that sounds like it's after the flood, because the flood is stopped, hence no more rock being generated, and it somehow bakes, cooks, tweaks, magics into rock, it lithifies in a hurry. Well, where does the canyon come from? Well, they'd have to have a second slosh of water. So the mood that certainly from the 1980s up to recently, the argument was that there was like puddles that were formed upstream of the present canyon that formed like a big lake, and not unlike the breaching of the ice dams in the Missoula flooding, and you get that connection being made by their apologetics, that then breached and sloshed down to cut the canyon itself in the already rock stuff that itself was laid down by the actual big slosh flood. And this, of course, is taking place years after, weeks after, centuries after. We're really vague about that in the creationist literature. But the problem is that the regular paleontology had thought about the interesting bits about the course of the Colorado River and whether there was a canyon there for a long time before the big one forms, and whether the Colorado rivers and other drainage systems change course because of the dynamics of what's happening to the Colorado Plateau. That this stuff is being pushed up regionally. This whole area is being pushed up, and that's what forms incised canyons. We have a section on it in The Rocks Were There, on the whole points about how the Grand Canyon fails to qualify as a flood style canyon because it's not like this with nice, neat, sheer walls. It's a nested V-shaped incised canyon, which is characteristic of canyons that are formed when the inlet versus the outlet change dynamics faster than the water can erode it. So you can either do it by raising the Colorado Plateau, which is what happened with the Grand Canyon, or drying up the Mediterranean Sea temporarily, which is what happened during the Messinian desiccation. Either one changes the distance of there, and that's when you get incised canyons. And the Mediterranean, as we documented in The Rocks Were There, has a whole slew of little mini Grand Canyons, including, drumroll, the Nile. The Nile didn't look the way we're used to the Nile. In fact, the present form of the Nile is ridiculously recent because the desiccation of the Mediterranean was about 5 million years ago. It silted up fairly recently. That through most of its time after the Mediterranean refilled, which temporarily had the most spectacular waterfall on the planet. Had the Australopithecines wanted to exploit this, they would have been at a fabulous opportunity for souvenir selling to their fellow hominids. But unfortunately, they were way south in Africa and were not able to hear this deafening super waterfall that was the entire Gibraltar Strait. Anyway,
yeah.
Bringing shrimp and crap and stuff in from the Atlantic Ocean and refilling the area. Well, that water simply refilled that incised canyon of the Nile. So you had what would have seemed just a large series of estuaries coming in from the Mediterranean all the way down to Aswan area. And it would have looked more like what we would see in the Puget Sound and a lot of space like that. In the millions of years since, the Nile has silted. The very process that makes the silt that overflows the land, well, eventually it's filling up the bloody thing. So the amount of water that's coming down every year is running into more and more sediment that's building the bottom. And the reason why they know this is because when they built the Aswan Dam, the Soviets that came in there were trying to find where they could get bedrock for the dam. And there wasn't any bedrock there until they dug way down. They were doing seismic studies, and that's when they discovered this V-shaped canyon. That it would have been right after the Messinian salinity crisis, about a 900-foot deep canyon, all the way from Aswan down into the Mediterranean Sea, and then it refilled and then eventually silted up. So all of that stuff is, and you got sources of the yin yang and that in Rocks Were There, which I suppose is an excellent opportunity for
Indeed.
us to put up the convenient commercial for our show. Our little Rocks Were There. There's our little Rocks Were There thing, and let's get this over here and run our little commercial that Peter kindly did for our book. Straight
Yay.
Science Answers to Creationist Questions. It's
Go, Peter.
thick, It's detailed, beautifully documented with thousands of sources, thoroughly indexed, and we're bloody hell proud of it. It's got a variety of useful charts on feathered theropods, on listing of technical papers, on the geology of the Grand Canyon, although there's going to be more of that in volume 2. It's got some juicy little appendices, which are great reference works for the number of phyla that there are, for the formation of the genetic code, and all the up-to-date information for the geological system. We got all of that stuff. And so it's well worth the bloody hell money for it. And volume 2 is going to be continuing with that. We wanted to make it so that it's a one-stop text that introduces you to the protagonists, the issues that are involved. And when Jackson suggested that we should do this project, it took me all of 1 microsecond to say, "Oh shucks, yes."
Absolutely.
But it grew into a very big work. And so amazingly, this monstrosity that's so big is just half of the material that we were structuring for the volume. So all the material, we allude to a little bit on the human evolution angle. I suppose it was the structure of the way that we were writing the book together, and a lot of this was the way you were structuring it, is that we allude to a lot of topics and then return to them in the course of the book. So it made it an easy thing to split apart, to where, yes, we're bringing up some stuff, so you get some really neat, juicy material on evolution of human beings, and you get stuff on the geology stuff and the Grand Canyon, and there's a lot of material, and also material on tetrapods and fish and a whole bunch of things. And then we're going to be returning to those in even more detail with chapters devoted to the evolution of tetrapods and the flood model of notions to how to try to explain the Grand Canyon. And there will be even more geology and paleoclimate material and continental movements, and all of that is, and the human evolution sections and stuff on then the cultural issues, like the ones that are arguing that Darwin was helping the Nazis and all the racism that's due to evolution, and there wasn't any racism at all anywhere except the stuff that's coming from the nasty Darwinian evolutionists. Oh, gee whiz, that one pops up an awful lot, to where we have to kind of set the character straight on that. As flawed human beings had some odd notions, but by standards of 19th century racists, Darwin wasn't much of one.
Yeah.
And to bring up a lot of that little side issue material, which connects up as well. We allude to Ernst Haeckel. We have a big long section in volume 1 on the whole issue of vestigial organs, and I think that one is one of those chapters that really, for anybody that hasn't bought the book, they're going to be amazed at just how wrong the creationists have been on the vestigial organ issue. That they're just missing crap on a colossal scale.
Yeah, on all issues, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Beej says the oldest water in the world was found in Timmins, Ontario, a water source in a mine, 0.6 billion years old, 600 million. So that's Precambrian. Oh my. And needless to say, the water bottling industry will try to do that. All they need to do is to put it in like a copper bottle, and then all of the crank magical healing things can try to sell this thing. I've seen people trying to sell COVID masks laced with copper. I don't know why they have this obsession with copper as supposedly the magical property. You get every once in a while copper rings and copper bracelets and copper this and copper that, supposedly. I mean, I suppose I could stick a copper colander on my head and get healthy that way, but I don't think that would really work very well. Anyway, Beach says, closer look found the tiny chemolithic lithotrophic microbes, life hanging on by its toenails. Yes, that's an interesting area. Because of what's been prodded in my head about the great sorting work with my research here, it's the thing that sticks in my head, and probably everybody that is looking into paleo issues should always keep in their heads is that the only thing we have to look at genetically are extant organisms. And we should never proceed from the idea that everything that you need to know are still around.
It's 1.6 billion is what I think she meant to type.
Okay. That's even older. Yeah. For example, I think the reason why it's hard to pin down exactly where mitochondria are coming from, which bacterial form is the original symbiont, is that the group that mitochondria developed from might be extinct now. And that's why it's hard. All we are looking at are its close cousins that did survive, neither one of which is a complete perfect fit, as opposed to cyanobacteria that are definitely turning into chloroplasts. And I don't think there's any dispute at all in the scientific community that that paternity suit has been established, because the cyanobacteria are still around to look at. And I suspect that's what may have happened with the mitochondria, is that they're gone. And so we have to wonder how many, in looking through, I have a big pile of material that I've been sorting out on the origin of eukaryotes, and then also the development of metazoa before the Cambrian explosion. And I'm wondering there, in that billions of years, boring, dull things where they're just little bacteria that aren't leaving fossil record because they're just bacteria, that there may be amazing ranges of now extinct lineages that played major roles, and there would be the equivalent of mass extinction events going on in the bacterial realm that are functionally invisible because we don't have living remnants of them calibrated.
Indeed.
Yeah. And that's what makes it that the only way that we're going to kind of figure that out, and this is something way above my pay grade, but theoretically, somebody's going to be able to work out the structure of the mitochondrial ancestor as a virtual organism. And that's going to be true, I think, for an awful lot of paleoecology as they start diving into what's going on and start modeling things on a planet-wide scale, as you have more and more sophisticated computer technology and more modeling technology, because we're already doing that in other areas. They're now starting to model ancient plate movements based upon the scrunched up remnants of the folding and subduction events that are still buried down in the planet. That involves high level imagery. And you've got the same thing going on, that organisms have consequences and they have dynamics. And this evolvability issue, that some versions of life would be consistent with the endosymbiotic events, and they will be able to do paleo reconstructions. And I think this is the kind of field that's going to be really interesting and annoying for creationists over the next 10 or 20 years, as they get just farther and farther ahead on ferreting out what's going on. Because I've been noticing there's discussions about what role manganese processing was playing instead of oxygen in oceans in the period of around the time of the Great Oxidization event. And you've got roles of what's happening with sulfur and various elements that are different, apparently, than the kind of dynamics we see in living ocean systems with living organisms that we deal with. For example, shirts, I think, are no longer made in the fossil record because of the fact that I think the calcium or something that's involved with producing them, it's sucked up by diatoms now. So you have a totally different ocean chemistry dynamic. And they can tell from tracers that as we go back in time, around the time of the cryogenic and the superglaciation and all that, that it looks like there's a different ocean chemistry dynamic going on. I think that's one of the reasons why we have so many lagerstatons in the Cambrian, in that area along the equator, is that there's a unique ocean chemistry going on because of the interactions of the way those organisms are going. And in principle, that stuff is interpolatable in terms of the biochemistry. And as they work out more and more on which gene systems are involved in very ancient organisms. Well, thank BJ for that, the chat on the oldest water on Earth thing in there. Beach says, my favorite bit, annoyed creationists. Yes, if one needs to have a hobby, may I recommend creationism annoying. because there's enough of them around that you don't have any difficulty encountering them. And if you study it in any detail, one, you'll have an annoyed creationist, and two, you'll learn shit, not from the creationists, but from researching the material you need to know in order to make an annoyed creationist. So it's a no-lose situation, I think.
Indeed.
Yeah. So were there any questions in the live chat that I managed to miss or comments? I think I got everybody in.
I
We're
think you have.
past I think we're past the hour on here. We'll count ourselves lucky that we didn't have any glitches, and I was able to see the chat overlay and all that kind of stuff. And Jackson is hot at work on all of his projects, and I'm now getting ready to gear shift back into the full writing mode now that the tail end of the great sorting is finished. If you had ever had a chance to see my basement, and it would have looked like a pathetic hoarder's world of stack after stack of paper that were blocking off my shelves and things, and it would look pathetic. And the fact that I've now been able to rearrange all of that means I've got a handle on it. Lisa asks, how can they ignore all the evidence? I will put one word up for token. That's all it takes. And it's true, independent of the evidence frame, is that if you have a mind that doesn't think about things it doesn't want to think about, that has a natural insulating buffer, that has objects of desire that it wants to be true, and will just not think about parts that conflict with it. This is related to confirmation bias and a whole bunch of other stuff. It's effortless, and it doesn't depend on the person being brilliant or stupid. It doesn't depend on them being politically conservative or liberal. It doesn't depend on whether they're religious or not, although if you want to see examples of the behavior on steroids, look at a religious creationist, and you will be able to see the Tortucan behavior on full bore. But you can see it in other contexts, and that's probably the toughest area that following the model is noticing where it's occurring also in people who believe things that are true, or people that happen to be on the same political or cultural side as you, but they still have a Tortucan mind. And I think an awful lot of Tortucans will be falling below the radar unless somebody asks them the right question, in which case you find out, oh, you also believe that? Whoa, okay. And that's why you can find people who would be anti-creationist who also believe in the moon landing hoax and conspiracy theories. And so you can find a variety. We'll be alluding to that in future projects as things come along in that. So the idea that bad method yields inevitably bad belief doesn't connect up, and bad method doesn't necessarily lead to personalities or you. Some bad beliefs are gigantic universals. They're like a mob. Creationism is like that. It's a giant worldview, and it has to devour everything that doesn't fit it. But you can find people that are Tortucans that are niche. They just happen to have that tiny little slice of Tortucanosity, a narrow, deep rut. So they could be believing in evolution and the age of the earth and everything is just fine, but they might also think that space aliens wrote Shakespeare or something like that. That you go, whoa, okay.
Yeah.
So that's why the questioning goes on. That you want to ask people, probe at a methods level as well as content level, because you might not ever hit that methods speed bump unless you probe at that. That's part of the lesson of the source methods approach to things. It's fun. Use it all the time. Anybody that follows me on Twitter will be seeing me probe people for their source material to find out where they're getting information from. And if people ask me for my sources, I go, "Oh, glad you asked," and proceed accordingly. So I think that Beach is shutting down brain techniques. That's pretty much what we have involved in that. If you if you read at my website, download the material that I've already put up there, the various things on the Tortucan mind in the various creation chapters. I wasn't using the term initially as broadly as I do now because I was just getting into the thing. So this is like 15, 16 years ago material, but the basic concepts are still there. That by their methods shall ye know them, and bad methods yield bad results, and they can't prevent it. So I think we've got ourselves covered for the week. Everybody stay safe. If you haven't been vaccinated, get vaccinated. If you bump into people who refuse to wear masks and or get vaccinated, try to gently persuade them to change their mind, regardless of their political persuasion, because the only way we're going to get back to normalcy is if we get really well under control on that, because the virus don't care a damn bit about it. It's going to do what it's going to do, and it's really good at doing what it's doing. And we have to work around that. So everybody stay safe. All see you next week, and shutting down for the